Welcome to an evening with Steve Hoather to learn more about how he scratch builds diesel locomotives. Steve Hoather built his first diesel loco in 1966, and 50 years later it was featured in a light-hearted article in the Gazette in August 2017. His latest creation is a baby Deltic, and he will show his construction techniques and some of his other locos. You will have seen the video that you were asked to watch with various examples of Steve's work on track with sound effects. And I'm sure you will agree with me when I say they really are superb examples of his modelling. Steve, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you.
Right, thank you, Jackie. Just check, can you hear me? Put a thumb up, Jackie, if you can. Great. Thanks for listening in. As Jackie said, my talk is about building diesels with particular reference to a baby Deltic, which I've just finished and took a number of slides during the construction. This was one of 2 or 3 locos I built during lockdown. And I must say, this hobby was a great help during lockdown. You can see my motto, keep calm and build model railways. You can just see the top of the shirt. I'll stand up. That was a present from my daughter a couple of years ago. Okay, if we can have the first slide, please, Jackie. And the next one, please. I meant the one after. Right, well, first of all, for those of you who don't know what a baby Deltic looks like, I'll just tell you a little bit about them. They were built, 10 were built in around 1959 to 1960. They were part of what is known as the pilot scheme of diesel locos right at the beginning of dieselisation on BR. They all went to King's Cross Division, based initially at Hornsey, then at Finsbury Park when that opened. They were, shall we say, not very successful, and within 2 or 3 years, they were all stored out of use at Stratford, where I think this photo was taken. After a couple of years more, they were all rebuilt, mainly changes to the engine, but the most noticeable difference was the nose ends were fitted with the 4-character train describer panels. So my model is of one of the locos in its as-built condition, which is actually not quite as this. I've just noticed both these have the mesh over the radiators removed. That was apparently a very early modification because they used to get bunged up with dirt and hence cause overheating. So mine is in a slightly earlier condition, but basically as per this, that gives you a feel of what I'm trying to achieve. Next slide, please, Jackie. Just in case you didn't see the video, this is the model. It's actually hauling the empty stock of the Aberdonian, so it's got the correct empty stock head code on the discs. Just one point I'd make at the beginning is this is not a super detailed model. I find it's important to get the right detail on rather than get everything on. By that I mean, before you start, stand back, have a look at the real thing if you can, or photographs, and try and work out what bits of detail actually show up the most. As an example, if we look at the the engine room side windows here, they're those small windows along the side, if Jackie could point to them. Yeah. These have separate window frames on the real thing, but they're painted green, so they don't really show up that much. But if you look at a lot of other diesels, like the big Deltics or DP2, they were chrome plated and left unpainted, so they show up much more. So on models of those, I fitted separate window frames and painted them. On the baby Deltic, I didn't bother. Okay. Right, well, the first thing is to get good information, both drawings and photographs. I'd thoroughly recommend this book. It's a book of 4mm scale drawings of virtually all the BR mainline diesels. There's 2 editions. This is the second one, which includes some of the mid-60s prototypes. It's ring bound, so it opens out flat. And although it's 4mm scale, if you go to your village photocopier, it's easy to enlarge them to 7mm. I found that if the newsagent knew how to work the machine, you can do it you have to do it in 2 stages, probably 150% first and then exact. But you can get it to, they can zoom to an exact percentage. So if you work out, for example, on the Bogey centers, what length you actually want in 7mm and take a rule with you, you can actually measure it as you do it and do that both vertically and horizontally, because sometimes there's an aspect ratio problem. But it's worth spending a little bit of time getting the scale right, because, okay, 5mm in the length wrong doesn't sound much, but it throws the construction out and you get dimensions wrong, and photocopiers after all are only 30p each or something. So well worth spending time getting drawings. And next photo, photographs, including some from different angles. So on the side view of the 2 locos, you'll notice they're both facing the same way. Get photographs of the other side, because there are bound to be differences. In the case of the Baby Deltic, there is an extra louver at the, what on this photo is the left-hand end, which if you haven't got photographs, you won't see. Photographs of the roof are useful because it's often not clear from drawings what the detail on the drawing is. So collect as many as you can. You can't go wrong. And of course, color ones are best for when you come to do the final painting. Right, well, these are the basics. Basic materials are plasticard and wood. I'll just explain why I use these. Plasticard is fairly obvious. It's got a good smooth surface. It needs sanding to make paint adhere, but otherwise you can fix detail easily, you can cut it easily, and you can get it thin for fixing glazing. So on the body side, engine room windows that I referred to earlier, you can get the glazing so it looks reasonably flush. The wood is simply to give strength. You can use plasticard in the thicker layer for strength, but it's actually difficult to get the mech pack to penetrate over large areas. So the wood on the body side, you can see there, is a beachy hardwood from one of the model suppliers. I think probably Eileen's Emporium, but most firms probably sell it. You'll notice because the middle one there is from the inside, you'll notice the apertures for the glazing are bigger than the actual, that's the radiator, just a bit to your right, Jackie, that's it. That aperture is bigger than the actual window, so you can fit the glazing recessed into the wood. If you go further to the right, Jackie, those are the cab side and cab windows. They have been bent by immersing in hot water, and I can show you the jig at the end, hopefully. But basically, if you clamp plasticard in a preformed jig, pour boiling water on it for about a minute, then pour colder water on it to cool it, it comes out curved, more or less to the profile you want. And the bottom bit is obviously the roof. That's just a piece of old scrap wood I had in the garage. Please don't ask me what sort, because I haven't a clue. But you can see at the ends, there's recesses for the top of the cab doors. And you'll see later on, the actual end is carved out so that the end doesn't show up on the cab windows. Also, Jack, if you go back to the middle one on the left, that bulkhead, that is firmly glued, there's one to each end. This model is a bit difficult in there is no join between the flat side and where the roof starts curving. So I made a decision to make it in 2 bits, the side and the roof. But at the join, it needs to be absolutely rigid, because if it's flexible, where it's joined, it will start cracking and will show through the paint. So those 2 bulkheads, there's one on the other half as well, make it into a fairly rigid box. Okay, next slide, please, Jackie.
Steve, just before we move on,
Yeah.
we had a question from Mr. Price about the thickness of plasticard, not just for the louvers, but also...
Yes, sorry, the body side is 20. The louvers, I've got a sketch here. I don't know whether it's, basically it's layers of 10 thou for the louvers with, and they're sort of 4.5 mil wide strips with 20 thou next to it by 3 mil wide, and then that repeats itself, but all mech packed at an angle. Got a very crude sketch here. I don't know whether it's going to show that. Does that make any sense? It shows up on my screen. So they are all mech packed together, and the right hand side is the visible bit where the, so looking from the top there, the top one is 10 thou. Let's start at the beginning. This is a cross section of the louvers. I should have said that. The top one is 10 thou, 4.5 mil wide. The next one is 20 thou, 3 mil wide. Then it repeats itself in pairs, but each pair is mech packed about 1.5 mil to the right. So it sort of comes at an angle. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. If not, please come back to me on that. Did that make sense to John in particular? Oh, I've gone back, right. Okay, next slide, please. Right, another view of the same basics. You'll notice the wood on the sides is extended almost to the end, as that's to support the end sections. Left a bit, Jackie. Left a bit to point out the cab. That's the cab side and cab roof. A lot of people don't realise the ends on nearly all diesel locos are tapered inwards from the beginning of the cab, which coincides with the bogey pivot. That's to keep it within gauge on curves. So that thin piece of wood, well, not thin, shallow piece of wood sticking out is actually got a saw cut on the inside, or will have, it's not there yet, and has a very slight inward bend where the cab door joins it. Okay, next slide, please. Right, this is the those bits glued together. You can see a bit more on the roof now. A big hole cut out for the radiator. And if you come to the left, Jackie, at the end of the roof, you can see I've carved, and literally with a Stanley knife and a semicircular rasp, I've cut out the inside of the cab roof so it doesn't show in the cab windows. Main point of this slide, though, is to show this brass subframe, which has the buffers shanks on it, the buffer beams. A bit to your left, Jackie, that's it. Then if you go a bit to the right, you can see the stretcher for the bogey pivot just before the wooden bulkhead. Bit to your right, Jackie, to your right, keep going right, then up at 45 degrees. That's the pivot, the bearer for the bogey pivot. So that takes the weight. And of course, it's repeated the other end. So all the load bearing bits are fixed to this brass subframe in one form or another. You could say the wooden plasticard are just ornaments in a sense. The problem with doing it this way is you've got to do all the soldering on the brass before you actually make it non-removable. Otherwise, if you need to do some more soldering, you're going to melt some plasticard. So you'll see later on, the plasticard ends don't get fitted until much later on. Okay, next slide, please. This, you can now see the curved, you can see the recessed cab doors. That's there. They are, like most English electric locos, set back a bit. Then the curved cab top and windows. And then the flat white plasticard bit is just to hold the two sides together at the top to keep the sides vertical, and the bottoms of those sides are glued or will be glued over the brass subframe. But that, oh, and on the right there is the beginnings, I was going to say the beginnings of the end. I didn't actually mean that. The beginning of the construction of the nose end It's several layers of 60 or 80 thou plasticard. Put a lot of mech pack on it and leave it for several days, probably a week to dry, because it takes a while to soak in and then it's slow to dry in the middle. And then with coarse sandpaper, I eventually sand that to profile. This is where that drawing is very useful, and I make little templates from the drawing to get the profile both vertically and horizontally. Okay, next one, please, Jackie. Right, beginning to take shape now. You can see the roof. It's actually sections of, I can't remember whether this is 20 thou or 15 thou plasticard. Bend it to shape first over a wooden former before sticking it down, because plasticard will always try and relax if you don't get it to the right shape first. So they are bent more or less to profile. The joins you see there will eventually be covered by joining strips. They are in the places on the drawing where it shows drawing strips. And you can see there where's the arrow gone? I can't see it. The cab windows. Could you point to cab end windows, please, Jackie? There we are. They are simply 15 or 20 thou, I forget which, and it doesn't make much difference. Can you get further left to the actual windows that go across the width of the logo? That's it. They are surprisingly strong because at the top, make it into effect, by building up with plasticard, you make it into effect a curved L-shaped angle. And then with a lot of sanding. And you can see I've got the top of the nose end in, but I've left the end because I haven't, or I'm not yet sure that I've finished soldering onto the brass subframe. That's about all on that one. So next slide, please, Jackie. Right, that's another very similar view showing the cab windows a bit better. You can see how the cab doors are recessed. The cab come a bit to your right, that's it. But that's the basic logo taking shape now. So next one, please. Right, I'm going to come back to building the bogies later. But at this point, it's important to get the basics right. Get the buffer heights right. This is sitting on a piece of glass, as you can see. Get the buffer heights right. Make sure the body is sitting vertically, hence the set square. And do some test running. Make sure it will go around curves without shorting, without the wheels or anything else jamming on parts of the body. Because if you don't do it now and you've got to cut anything away, it's much more difficult once you've added more detail. I mentioned earlier an extra louver ventilator on one side only. If you can come to near the front, Jackie, just behind the front cab door and go up, that's it. See, that wasn't on the drawing. Well, it was dotted on the drawing. It wasn't at all clear, the dimensions. And without photographs, I could easily have missed it. It's on one side only. Okay, we'll move on to the next one, please.
Can I just say for a moment to Ian, I obviously can't see questions at the moment while I'm doing screen share. So if any pop up on chat, would you mind asking them for me?
No problem. I am keeping an eye on that, Jackie.
Thank you.
Lovely. Don't hesitate to interrupt me, Ian. I mean, if there's a question that's topical while I've got a slide up, it's easy to answer it there and then.
Okay.
Okay, this is ready for its first run. Still no ends, mounted on the more or less completed bogies. I always, more importantly, steam locos, I always test it on DC first, because if there's any tight spots or anything, particularly in valve gear, I know that doesn't apply here, DC will show it up, whereas DCC, the decoder overcomes any stiffness and will run smoothly, even if you've got something binding every 180 degrees or whatever. So this first test run was probably on DC, I can't actually remember. And take it several times around the layout, turn it around, do it the other way on curves, and get yourself happy. This one didn't give any trouble. My previous one, the Bogey side frames were much closer to the body headstocks. And because the Bogey side frames are live to one polarity, I found on certain curves, I had a short circuit between the Bogey frame and the brass subframe on the body, sorry. I'd rather find that out at this stage rather when the thing's painted and you think you've finished. Right, next one, please. Right, close up, but also showing the water and fuel tanks. These are made of brass, which might surprise you, mainly because they've got to have a lot of lead in them to give weight. I don't know how much at the time I took this slide. So they're supported on a brass angle channel, which you can see above me. If you can just, that's it, Jackie, along there. That's just a brass angle, which is bolted to the brass subframe I showed you earlier. Then the fuel tanks, and one of those two is fuel, one's water, and I can't remember which is which. They are soldered to that angle, so the whole unit is removable. You can just see the motor through the aperture for the radiator. I'll come back to the details of the motor later. Other than that, not much has changed from the previous one, but this is the trial running stage. Next one, please. I seem to have frozen. I'm putting my hand up and I can't see myself. Anyway, you've got the message. Right, this is the underneath. I use generally lock sound, ESU lock sound decoders. And this particular one is from Howell's Models of Oxford. They do what they claim is a baby Deltic. Obviously, it's not a genuine recording, but it's very realistic. I can vaguely remember baby Deltics, and I can remember that it was the same sort of tone as the big Deltics, but a slightly lower pitch. And I think they've got that right. You can see three-way plugs and sockets for each bogey. Can you just point at those, Jackie? That's for one bogey, and that's for the other. There are two tail lamps at each end, not fitted yet. They're just small 3mm LEDs. You've seen those working in the video, and you'll probably see them later in one of the photographs. You can see the bulkheads behind the cab. If you could just, the wooden, that's it. So that makes it in a very rigid box structure. And just where Jackie's arrow is, she knows what I'm going to say, I think. The pivot on the left-hand side is actually insulated from that brass frame. That's because the two bogey frames are live to one rail, but live to opposite rails. So you have to insulate the two from each other. So that one Jackie's pointing at is insulated, whereas the one at the other end is live to the bogey frame and forms one half of the current path. So the plugs and sockets are three-way, and the fourth way is through the bogey pivot. I should explain 4 ways: 2 for pickup from the rails and 2 for going back to the motors. They have to be separate when you're using DCC. Okay, nothing more to show on that, except pointing out the obvious. I still haven't fitted the nose ends. Okay, next slide, please, Jackie. Right, we're now coming to I fitted the nose ends, as you can see. There are lots of joints in the plasticard, and this is the stage at which you start hiding them. The way I do it is fill them with Humble model filler, let that dry, and then paint over with a fairly thick layer of any good paint. Let it dry for a couple of days, and then sand it with a Garaflex block. And if you haven't seen those before, we'll have the next slide. Sorry, out of order. Can we go to the next one, please, then come back to this one? That's it. Garaflex block is shown there. It's a fairly rigid block of sanding material. This is the fine one. And if you sand it across the joins, it leaves a smooth surface. If you go along, it'll tend to dig into the filler because the filler is very soft. So now if you could go back, Jackie, sorry for that. I've sanded it. I've sprayed it with undercoat. Inevitably, some bits I've missed of the filler. So the dark green bits are the bits I missed first time, which you don't really see until you've spray painted it. There, and another one there. And so I sand those and then spray it again. And so if we go on to the next one, please. No, sorry, I meant really the next one, not that one. On here, I've sanded again the areas where I need to fix bits with mech packs. So anything like radiator surrounds, yes, down a bit left. That's it. The radiator surrounds has a trim around it. The nose ends where you were first, Jackie, they have a lot of details, nose end doors and so on. On the roof, the radiator has a circular cover strip around it and cover strips over most of those joints. But the center of the roof is hidden by a big cover strip, so I haven't bothered sanding that. So the white bits I've sanded, the grey I've just left, probably sand it light just to make sure it's smooth. Okay, next one, please. I think we get back into order. Yeah. So that is almost the thing, ready, the body ready for painting. Notice the nose end doors are now fitted. The tail lamps left a bit jacky and up. That's it. They are simply 3mm LEDs pushed into a hole from behind. If you can point at the buffers, please, Jackie, you can see why I left the nose end till last, because the buffers come through a hole, and before it's painted, I've filled up the hole's a bit too big. But those buffers are soldered to the brass subframe, and if I'd had to solder anything else on the brass subframe, it would have melted the plasticard around it. So that, I think, is the body about ready for painting. So let's go on to the next one, please. Sorry, no, I forgot that one. Should look at the note, shouldn't I? Yeah, go on to the one showing the speaker, please. This is the fuel tank and water tank. A little bit of lead weight on the left, you can see. That's just molded on the gas cooker in a little molded brass or aluminium former. The important thing here is the speaker. It's most important to get the biggest speaker you can possibly manage. It makes a huge difference to the sound quality. So this one is 50mm, and I actually started off first with the small one, and it wasn't nearly as good. So I went for this. It just about fits within the body. You can see because that's black paint on the side of it, and the scrape marks are where it's scraped when it goes into the body. You'll notice white metal cast air reservoirs right a bit jacky and up there. They're just ones from the scrap box. But the transverse air reservoir, I didn't have one the right size, so I turned up a brass one in the lathe. And gauges on the side of the fuel tanks. Well, one's a gauge, one's an access hatch. They're just, I think, glass stamping is just soldered on. Okay, next one, please. Right, we'll turn to the bogies. First of all, the side frames. These are purely cosmetic. I bought them years and years ago at a bring and buy sale, I think. But they're basically standard English electric four-wheel bogies, motor bogies, virtually the same as the Class 20. The differences are they have all these holes drilled in the bottom equalising beam. That was actually to save weight. I read somewhere there was a big argument over these locos. They were too heavy, and BR would not accept them at first because they were designed to work over the widen liners to Moorgate and Blackfriars in the southern region. And there was a very severe weight limit on Blackfriars Bridge at that time. So to try and reduce the weight, they changed some of the steel paneling to aluminium. They also drilled these holes, and they took off one of the sandboxes each side. So the sandbox on the left is the outer end, that's still there. You can just point to that, Jackie. But on the inner end, they took the sandboxes off, so the inner wheels don't have sanding. And I just, when I got the castings, they had those sandboxes, I just cut them off. So that's the side frames, and I made the footsteps from brass and just super glued it on. Turning to the works, the actual motor bogie, the motor gearbox unit, as it says, is a standard MSC helical diesel two-stage unit. ABC do a very similar one, and I could have used either, to be honest. The important thing is they're helical. They're much quieter than the old worm gears, much more efficient, so the current consumption is much less, which means you can use a smaller decoder, and that's very important on steam locos. and they're much quieter. The pivot in this case is in the center of the bogey, just to the left. It's basically a hole in the top plate and two side bearers each side. One bogey has a fairly wide side bearer to give stability, and the other one is little more than just a washer. And the R painted or felt tip pen on top is just to tell me it's the radiator end as opposed to the boiler end. Okay, next slide, please. This is the underframe, shows the arrangement better. So the motor drives onto one axle, which is actually the inner axle, so the motor doesn't protrude into the cab. Then there's a Delrin chain drive to the other axle. The other axle, the non-motor one, is compensated. That improves current pickup. I don't use chain tensioners for the chain, because if you get the bogey centers right and get the chain about the right tension to start with, it doesn't seem to stretch. But I did do a bit of friggery to get the centers right, so I think the holes in the top axle were slightly oval, and I soldered the brass bearing bush in at the right distance to get the chain tension right. The headstocks, as you can see, are brass channel, and the two headstocks with the side frames form a one-piece unit. So there's just two screws at each end that secure the headstocks to the main bogey frame, and then the headstocks and side frames all come off in one unit. So the cast side frames are superglued and pinned to the headstocks. Right, I think that's all on that one. Next one, please. That's an underneath view. I put a plasticard cover plate on, partly to stop any oil dripping on the track, but also the chain, when the bottom end of the chain is slack, which depends on which way you're going, rather than have it hanging down, it just runs very gently on that plasticard bottom cover. You can see the guard irons there. They're just brass T-angle, and they're made deliberately weak where they join the bogey in case they get knocked in a derailment or anything. The wheels are Roxy diesel wheels, insulated on one side only. So as I said earlier, each bogey frame picks up through the non-insulated side. The two bogies are made the same way round, but because you turn one round to fit it, when they're on the body, they pick up from opposite sides. And the insulated side has pickups, which I think is the next slide, please. Yes, these are the pickups for the insulated side. I find if you make pickups run on the tread, it keeps the treads much cleaner. So that's basically a piece of copper-clad laminate that Jackie is pointing to, with a homemade phosphor bronze torsional coil spring and a bit of nickel silver soldered on the end, which is rubbing on the tread. Not very neat soldering. You have to be careful not to get the copper clad too hot, otherwise the copper sometimes delaminates from the laminate. Okay, next one, please. Right, well, that's the baby Deltic. I'm now going to show some of the others I've done. You should have seen these in the video. They're all made basically the same principle. As you saw on the video, the head codes on those that have head codes are detachable. They're basically the bottom of tin cans with small magnets inside. 1A58 was actually a genuine East Coast mainline train going north. Ian Allen very kindly pointed out it was his initials at his age, so couldn't have done better, could I? More seriously, the bogey side frames on this one had to be scratch built. I couldn't find anything remotely resembling this loco. I should perhaps explain this loco is one of 3 prototypes built in about 1961, when BR had got the Class 40s and what we commonly know as peaks. They wanted something more powerful, and they wanted cocos rather than diesels with pony trucks as well to keep the weight down. And 3 private manufacturers all made prototypes. The British locomotive industry then was big enough to have 3 different prototypes, each privately built. This one has the same engine as the Class 47, but the body was built by BRCW, that's Birmingham Railway and Carriage and Wagon Company at Birmingham, who had built the Class 26s, 27s and 33s on the Southern. It ran for a short time on the Western on test and then on the East Coast. But within a couple of years, BR had decided on the 47, so this had served its purpose and was broken up. The delivery was, well, should we say, a bit unrealistic for a diesel loco. It had a travelling fitter with it, who I think his main job was to keep it clean. The decoder is, again, from Howe's model. They made it specially for me with a Class 47 engine sound. I made a guess that the horns were probably like Class 33s because they were building 33s at the same time. So that's what I've got for the horns. And as I say with all sound decoders, if someone's got evidence it's wrong, please show me and I'll try and correct it. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, it's correct. Next slide, please. This is another of the prototypes. This is the Brush Falcon. It had 2 engines, the Bristol Maybach engines, like in the Class 52 Westerns, but with electric transmission. The Bogey side frames are very similar to the Brush 2s, although technically they should have had a slightly different wheelbase, but I just used Brush 2 side frames. Again, the decoders from Howe's, he altered it slightly so it revs up slightly slower. It's a Class 52 engine sound, but revs up slightly slower when you open the throttle. And 2 randomly chosen horns. This one actually lasted quite a long time. After using on the Master Cutler for a long time, it went to the Western region where it worked Bristol Paddington trains until air conditioned stock or air brake stock came, when it went to South Wales and worked coal trains and lasted, I think, until about 1976. So that was the longest lasting of the 3 prototypes. And the next one, please. This is DP2, which was the English Electric contribution. It was basically a deltic body, although I learnt modelling wise it's not, because the radiator is totally different and the body side windows are different positions. So I had to scratch build it. But the real one was basically a deltic body. Ran on the East Coast for a long time, substituting for deltics when they weren't available. Lasted until 1967 when it was in a very nasty collision with a derailed cement train, which wrote it off. Modelling wise, this was the most difficult of the 3 because the body side is curved. So I actually used balsa wood for the body side to go behind the plastic guard. It was easy to sand. And it's got Class 37 or deltic bogies, the cast version, as they had later on. Otherwise, same principles as before. Just to complete the story of the real prototypes, having got the 3 prototypes, BR decided not to use any of them. They actually converted the order for the last 10 or so Class 46s, which are a brush Sulzer with a longer body. They made those Class 47s with the Sulzer engine and brush electrical equipment. And as everyone knows, about over 500 were built. They thought they'd give less trouble than the other types, but they gave a lot of trouble, particularly the engines. So for the last batch of 50, they ordered the Class 50s, which was a much, I'm not going to say improved, but much updated version of DP2. And that gave even more trouble than the 47s. So moving on to, I think, a couple of photographs of the baby Deltic finished.
Could I just ask, Steve, before
Yep.
we move on from this one, another question from Mr. Price. How do you make your window frames, as in the alloy thin frames, on the side windows of the DP2 and the cab front windows on the Falcon?
Yes, thanks for reminding me on that, Jackie. First of all, to say this is the example I quoted earlier where they are exactly the same window frames on the real thing as the Baby Deltic. But because they're chrome plated and show up, I chose to do them on this model, but not on the Baby Deltic. The way I do them is I don't cut out body side windows to start with. I cut out the frames to their outer dimensions in 10 thou plasticard without an aperture. So they're just blanks. I then mech pack those on in the correct positions, let them dry for a day or two, and then I cut out by drilling and filing and cutting the aperture in both the body side and the window frame, because they're now fused together. I cut them out together, which makes it much easier to get the very thin frame, because that frame is only about, from memory, 1/2 to 3/4 millimeter wide all the way around. And obviously you need needle files to get the inner radius, but the outer radius I got on the blank before I fixed it onto the body side. Does that answer the question? I think it was a John, wasn't it? You can just raise your hand if it answers. If not, we'll come back and deal with that now. I can't see him, but if Jackie
happy
can.
with that, Steve, yes.
Thank you. Right. Shall we move on then?
Thank you.
Right. This is a photo from an article I did in the Gazette. I forget the exact date, but anyway, about 4 or 5 years ago, I did an article on the 3 prototypes, and I threw in my blue Deltic, which actually is about 25 years old now. I made that before anyone started doing a ready-to-run production Deltic, sorry, prototype Deltic. Interesting contrast in liveries. They're all basically the same. The blue Deltic has totally different motor bogies because you couldn't buy the motor units that I now use. So that's much more complicated, but body-wise, they're the same sort of principles, plasticard on wood. Okay, next one, please. This one is quite an interesting one for 2 reasons. First of all, the model itself is now over 55 years old. I made it when I was at college. Similar principles, except there's more wood. So the end underneath the windows was plasticard on wood. But I found that the wood stretched a bit and forced apart the plasticard. You can't actually see it, but that's a lesson I learned. The main interest, though, is it had to go around 3-foot radius curves, which are pretty steep. And that, of course, is a Coco with a long wheelbase. It worked. And if we can see the next slide, I'll show you how I did it. This is a real bit of almost modeling archaeology. I moved the Bogey pivot to over the outer wheels where you can see it with the red arrow. So the inner end of the Bogey swings right round and comes out from underneath the body side when you're on curves. The middle wheel actually touches on the motor occasionally. So if you can just see on the middle wheel a black line across it, you just there. The wheel is actually insulated into 3 segments by cutting and then filling with aldite, which is quite a common technique I used to use when converting to 2-rail on steam locomotive spokes. But it means the part of the wheel in touch with the rail is not in touch with the motor, which is earthed to the frame of the Bogey, and hence can't short circuit. The motor itself is a Bonds motor. It was about the best there was in the 60s, sort of thing we used in steam engines. Thought they were quite good at the time, but they're only 3 poles, so they're very rough running at low speed. They're what's known as cog, and quite noisy, and worm gears, which is all there was at the time. And there wasn't a shaft at the end, so I couldn't fit a flywheel. It still runs. I managed to fit DCC. I had to make an extra insulated brush box to insulate the motor from the Bogey. I've never really got it to run smoothly at low speed. I've tried a couple of decoders, and it's more of a museum piece now. But yes, it still runs. And as I say, it's over 50 years old. Okay, moving on to the next one. Right, a couple of shots of the Baby Deltic. This is one you saw at the beginning. It's actually on the empty stock of the Aberdonian. That's a Gresley kitchen car, which was always at the back of the train going north because it was detached at York. But that gives the flavour of the loco. And the next one, that's on my quad art, which again is over 50 years old. That was scratch built. They were common, built especially for King's Cross, built down to a length for the platforms at Moorgate. Lasted well into the diesel era because the compartments were very narrow and BR standard stock had a lot less seats. So they kept these going as long as they could. And in the evening peak, it wasn't unknown for brush forward or one of these, which was quite an interesting experience. The things used to creak as if they were stretching as it accelerated. Okay, that I think is the last slide. Is that right, Jackie?
Can I just ask before we move on, you mentioned that this one was scratch built. Do you scratch build all of your coaching stock, Steve? And if so, is it the same principles that you use?
I've scratch built virtually all my stock, all the LNER stuff, though I have kit built some BR standards and I'm now kit building some LNER Suburban stock. Yes, they're all from Plasticard. I've changed my techniques over the years. This one has got wooden reinforcing below the windows. It was described in an article in Model Railway Constructor sometime in 1967. I don't suppose many of you still have that. Later on, I use Plasticard for the strengthening inside the outer layer, which I bend in hot water. And there was an article on that in, find my crib sheet, in the February 1998 Gazette with some drawings of how I did it. And then the Aberdonian was described in the May 2010 Gazette. So yes, I've gradually changed over the years. I take a great interest in LNER coaches, but scratch building does take a long time. And with good kits, and I'm using a Sidelines one now, you can actually get far more detail than I used to get with scratch building. I like to think I got the atmosphere of Gresley and Thompson coaches, but they're not as detailed as, say, a Sidelines kit is. So, you know, as the hobby's developed, you couldn't buy kits when I started. You can now, so where appropriate, I use a kit. Similarly with diesel locos, I've done kits from several manufacturers, but no one does a Baby Deltic. I don't like buying ready-made, so I haven't got a Falcon. I built that myself. Started just before Helium bought theirs out. Similarly with Lion, DP2, and the Blue Deltic I built before Laurie Lovelace bought one out. My fun is making things rather than running. I do run the layout when friends come, and I enjoy that. But when I'm by myself, I never run the layout. To me, the fun is the making.
Thank you. We'll hand over to any questions, and Steve's email address will appear on the video. So if you think of any questions after this evening, then obviously please contact Steve, or if you can contact me with any feedback as well. So thank you very much. That was really comprehensive, Steve.
I seem to have frozen. I'm standing there staring at the screen. Can you see me or what?
I can't
Well,
see
we've just
you.
got a blank screen, Steve.
All right. I look completely gormless with my mouth open. Oh, now I've got Jackie. That's far better.
I took you off spotlight and put you back on again, just see if it made any difference. But no, unfortunately, we've got a black screen at the moment. Let's, yeah, name is fine. That's fine. At least we've got your name up now.
Okay.
So
Right, happy to answer any questions.
Can't see Steve, but we can certainly get questions. The only thing we won't be able to see is you showing us the former for bending the cab windows. Anyway, first question. We've got one here from Alan Chandler saying, how about painting? Do you spray them? Is it always a matte finish?
Yes, I paint them. I use precision paints these days. I've got an airbrush, which I struggled when I first got, but I've had it about 30 years and usually it works. I actually normally paint gloss first because transfers stick much better with gloss. But in this particular case, because there's very little, there's no lining and there's only the cab numbers and the badge, I think I sprayed it semi-matte and then I put matte varnish on top, mainly to protect the transfers, but also to give a realistic finish. Because to me, gloss doesn't scale. If you make a logo really high gloss, it doesn't look right. So I prefer semi-matte or matte, depending on whether I'm going for weathered or X-Works condition. The 3 bits of that question, I can't remember the 3rd bit.
Is it sprayed, and also is it matte finish?
Right, so I've answered those. Yes, thanks, Alan. Glad to see you advertising the autocar on your screenshot. Alan and I worked together on the Northeastern petrol electric rail car, the real one. The co-host has asked me to start my video. Hang on. I'll try that. I've clicked start video. I'm still getting just the same. Wait a minute, I'm going to press it. Cannot start video, failed start the video camera. Please select another video camera in settings. Don't know what's happened there, but that's a message on the top right of my screen.
Any suggestions, Ian?
No, all I would suggest is if you go to the settings, which is if you click on the up, you go bottom left where it's got the video camera icon, click the up arrow, you'll then get the settings and you should be able to, it should come up with video and you should be able to choose camera.
Yes, I've got selected camera and HP wide vision HD cameras clicked, so I'll click that again, but still nothing.
Okay, don't worry then.
I think the only other thing would be to go all the way out and come back in again. But if people are happy, we can carry on with some questions. What do you use for radiator grills, please?
Right. If I interpret the question as me being the air intake grills, because the radiator is different, it's a steel mesh from the firm that makes very fine mesh, whose name escapes me, Superlink, I think. If I interpret the question as being air intake grills and come back, I've got it wrong, they are strips of plasticard, as I tried to show earlier, packed together at an angle. So when you've got a dozen or so strips, the louvers are at an angle. And I gave the dimensions as on my sheet. Top layer is 10 thou thick and 4.5 mil wide. Next layer, 20 thou thick and 3 mil wide. They go together as a pair. Then the next pair, which are the same, are mech packed underneath, but inset by about 1.5 mil. So as you build those up, it sets an angle. Now that may be different for different locos. It's a matter of trying it out to see what looks like for you. But basically, strips of mech pack overlapped and set at an angle. Did that answer the question, or did he actually mean radiators? Whereas I said it was a scale link steel mesh.
If the person who is coming up on my screen as Mr. Owner, would you like to just unmute and tell us whether that actually answers your question? No, let's take it as that's okay for the moment. And please, Steve.
You can always email me afterwards and I'll do a sketch and send it to you if it's not clear.
And then the next one from John and Christine Walker is, how do you arrange your compensation?
On a four-wheel bogey, I make the driven axle rigid. On the other axle, I have a little rocking beam across the bogey with a little bear in the middle, so that it rocks as per the track. And the little subframe has bearings at each end with the axle through it, obviously. And then it just rocks within the main bogey subframe, so that you've always got four wheels in contact with the track, which improves current collection no end. If you have a rigid bogey frame picking up current and rigid track, you'll only ever have three wheels in contact with the track. Every time the fourth wheel is drawing current and then breaks contact, it'll create a very slight spark, which will create a little bit of dirt, and it builds up over time. So I always compensate or spring my powered vehicles.
Thank you. And thank you to Mr. Owner for telling us that he's not equipped for direct contact. So it's not that he couldn't answer, didn't want to answer you. He just hasn't got that audio side. Ian, over to you. I know you've got
Steve.
a couple of questions.
Yeah, Steve, a question from me. Going back to the baby Deltic, where you've put the nose ends on last so that they go around the buffer shanks, the buffer bodies, that therefore means that you can't get any of the body subframe out of the body now, doesn't it? You can only remove the bogies or the central section.
Correct.
So has that caused you any problems with having to replace any electronics or any LEDs, for example?
No, the electronics is the decoder is screwed to the underside of the roof. It's not fixed to any of the brass. The LEDs are simply pushed in through holes from the inside, pre-wired, and they go back to the decoder. And the fuel tank unit, which has a speaker on it as well, is secured by 4 bolts. I showed that L-shaped subframe. So unless I get a collision and bend it or something like that, and I've got my fingers crossed, although you can't see it, I shouldn't need to do any more soldering on that subframe.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have any more questions from anybody else? Is there anybody that would like to unmute and ask a question? Or
I'll ask one from me very quickly while people are just coming up with their ideas. I know you can't show us the templates that you use when you're curving the plasticard, but can you describe it, Steve? Because obviously curving plasticard, what sort of temperature water, how long do you leave it in there? How do you make sure it doesn't go too floppy, so to speak?
Right. Well, the one I brought down to show you is for the cab side windows. It just bends the top part of the cab ends. If you remember, they were curved. It's 2 pieces of copper. About, under rule, I can give you the dimensions. They're about, let's do it in old-fashioned units, shall we? About 1.5 inches long by 1 inch wide. So they only cover the bit of the cab windows, cab side windows I'm going to curve. And they're bent to the profile slightly sharper than the radius I want. And one fits inside the other. I cut the windows out first. And I stress this is the cab side windows, not the end windows. I put the plasticard in between these 2 pieces of brass, copper, clamp them together with some small clamps. And I've got an old shepherd's pie tinfoil dish or something, which I put them in, and I pour boiling water in. And I only immerse in water the bit I want bent. The lower part of the body side wants to stay straight, so don't let it go in the water because it will wrinkle slightly. I leave it in for about a minute, pour the water out, and then pour colder water in to cool it down, and then separate the clamp and usually it comes out fine. If it doesn't, it's easy to do another one. For something like a roof, which I don't do now, but some of my early coaches, I did complete roofs. I have an old wooden roof, which I plain sanded to profile, and a sheet, I think, of aluminium, which I bent to the opposite profile. And I clamped a long sheet of plasticard in between the two, clamped the two together, and I left that in because it's wood and doesn't conduct electricity, heat so well, I meant to say. I left that in for probably about 5 minutes, same temperature, and then cool it down before taking it out to the jig. I think it's a fairly common technique now. I've heard of other people using it, but I'd stress if you bend plasticard and then hope it'll keep that bend, it won't. It'll gradually relax. It pays to, sorry, if you bend it without heating, it pays to get it in the profile you want, and then add the reinforcing bits or whatever you're going to do to keep that profile.
Thank you very much. Any questions from anybody else? If people prefer to ask their own questions, feel free to unmute and do go ahead and ask a question.
Hello.
Hello.
It's John Price.
Oh,
Steve,
John, yeah, I can hear you.
regarding fine. Regarding the cab windows on the Baby Deltic, the front cab windows, is there any special method for cutting them out, or and what plastic card thickness do you use for that?
The thickness was, I can't remember whether it was 15 or 20 thou, probably 20, I would think. That's one I've got lots of.
Yeah.
I had to have several goes because it's difficult geometry.
Yes.
To get, because the drawing looking end on is a bit confusing because the top of the nose end slopes. So it wasn't clear where the sharp radius between the bottom of the cab windows and the top of the nose was, if that makes sense.
It does, because I've actually had an attempt to building one of these and I failed miserably. You know,
Right.
I came
well,
up with the profile.
Sorry, I've lost you. Say that again, please.
I came unstuck regarding the actual geometry. You know, the front of the cab windows, like you say, the bottom windows either side. It's rather difficult to get because the complex sort of angles. If you can make, does that make any sense? The radius, the bottom radius. You've got your three windows on the front of the Baby Deltic.
Yeah.
It's not the center one. It's the ones either side, and it's the nearest to the edge, the bottom. It's sort of radius is down, but then goes straight up vertical, and then yeah. I just
yes, I struggled. And I struggled, and I think I had 2 or 3 attempts at that. That's one example where I found photographs fairly close up. I happen to have 1 or 2 good ones, very helpful. I think, thinking back, the key mistake I made to start with was the top of the cab windows in plan view is actually straight, and I assumed it was curved. Not sure whether the drawing was even right there. So I don't claim it's perfect. I think it looks about right, which is probably all you can ask for.
Yeah, the top of the cab window, the center cab window, it appears to be slightly higher than the windows either side on the top. Does that make any sense? I've got the plan.
I think from memory, it's on the same radius, which does mean slightly higher in the corners.
Yes.
I think the distance from the top edge of the metal to the top edge of the window is the same in the corner of the center window and the side window.
Yes.
But of course, the roof is curving down a bit by then.
Yes, it's some complex shapes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I managed to purchase some Helgen side frames, but the Class 20. It's for a garden railway, so I presume that would be okay to use, would it?
I would think so. Just if you want to be accurate, drill those holes in the bottom equalising beam. Well,
yeah, they're already in. They're actually already in.
Are they? Right.
Yeah.
and take the sandbox off on the inner ends.
Right, Steve. Thank you. Will you be at Doncaster, by the way?
I will, but I'm not bringing the loco, sorry,
Oh,
because there's too much risk of damage.
yes, yes.
But if you want to contact me, if you live anywhere near, you're welcome to come.
Yes, well, I live at Doncaster, so.
Right. Well, I'm a bit further north, but drop me an email.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Any more questions?
There's not a question, but Alex Dent has said to me, I found it stunning. I was thinking of having a go on building locomotives. And Nige Payne, who joins us from Slovakia, hi Nige. If you get stuck with the geometry of the Baby Deltic, you should contact the Baby Deltic project, which he's put the web link up to. We spent an awful amount of time working out the shape of the cab windows. They are different from the Class 37s and Class 40s, and he's right. Yeah, it does seem to be a slightly different profile to the 37s and 40s, even though they're from the same manufacturer, which is interesting.
Yeah, and the nose end is different as well.
Yes, yeah. I think Nigel's got something there in his hands that he's wanting to show us, maybe. No, just playing, Nigel. Anybody else? Does anybody else have any more questions? All these people,
Okay.
all these people interested in you building, scratch building diesels, and yeah, no questions, or very few questions.
So it's John Price again.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, go ahead.
So really, I dare say on a similar principle, you could adopt this, say, for a Class 91.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
No, you could do it for anything. If it was something without body side windows,
yes.
I probably wouldn't use 2 layers of plasticard. I might just use 1 thick layer.
Yes.
Certainly for the bit in the middle, you'd need thinner for the cab ends, obviously. But yes, I mean, I just happen to do diesel because the era model is sort of mid-50s to mid-60s.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm not sure about a pantograph in plasticard, though.
Excellent.
Well, depending upon your prototype, you can get those from Judith Edge, can't you?
Yes.
The old
yes.
DC ones, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Judith Edge kits will be at Doncaster. So there you are, a challenge for you.
Oh, excellent.
Okay, we normally finish at 9:30, but just before we do, I see that Dave Robinson has asked, what's the source of your horn?
My scrap box is a simple answer. I tend to collect bits I think I might want in the future. They are etched brass, Dave. They may have come from PRMRP, who was very helpful, and Peter Besant. I'm not sure about that. I think that may have been it. Not sure, but I think it was him. Certainly worth a try because he does various diesel loco types.
Okay.
GJ has just posted, perhaps there aren't many questions because everything was covered so well. Excellent talk. Thank you, GJ. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the compliment.
Well, I'd certainly like to echo that. First of all, before we look at what's happening next month, thank you very, very much to Steve. It's always quite daunting for people when we say to them, would you consider doing one of the evening with seminars? And we're very grateful to everybody who steps forward, everybody who's been volunteered by somebody else, which often happens. and you know, please do step forward. If you've got something that you would like to show people, we will be very happy to help you through that. Ian and Peter are very good at doing videos and helping people with video advice. Some people do a preview so that you've got something to watch before the session, and others just go straight into a PowerPoint or some footage of what they're talking about. So, you know, thank you very much, Steve. Really, really good comprehensive presentation. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal. So looking forward to next month. Back in November 2021, Jeff Langham and Peter Reynolds did a very interesting evening about the real railway and signals on the real railway and how they've applied that to their modelling. And this is going to go the next step on the 26th of June. It's going to actually show you how they actually got their signals working. We'll be live again from the SR7 group railway, which you saw last time. If you register, you will get a link to the video of the first session so that it can bring you up to speed with the whole concept of setting up signals on your railway. It certainly brings the railway to life, and it's something that's much more possible in 7mm than it is in some of the other scales. So our next evening with Sunday the 26th of June, it goes live for registration at midnight tonight, and obviously a reminder is sent to you nearer the time as well. But that's another evening with Jeff Langham and Peter Reynolds to find out how to get their signals working. A reminder that it's only 2 weeks to the Doncaster show. I've posted the full show guide on the website now, so you can have a look at the show guide. You can actually start to work out your shopping route and which traders you need to go and see. And there's some splendid layouts that have been chosen by Kevin Day. Advanced tickets are on sale, and again we've got a link to those from the website. And if on the website you go to events in the top menu bar and go down to Guild Summer Show, all the details of everybody who's attending, the traders and everything are there if you don't want to actually look at the show guide itself, but you can download the full 4 pages, full size in A4. In terms of other shows this year, we've publicised well in advance, so many of you have already seen the flyers, but we will be holding the 2-day convention of Guildex at the new venue in Stafford on the 3rd and 4th of September. And that's where we hope to have some new features in terms of some live streaming, which Ian will be involved in. And Peter Reynolds will also be having some seminars and workshops and trying to allow the special interest groups to get together and meet up as well. I know the 3D printing group have been talking about having a show and tell, and it would be really nice to see some of the things that they've actually built during lockdown. We've got a small layouts competition. All the entries are in for that, so there'll be a good chance to see that you can build O-gauge in a small space. And there's the usual modelling competition. Again, if you go to events in the website, scroll down to Guildex, all the details for the modelling competition are on that page. We've got some non-members with us again this evening, so just to mention that you can actually join the Guild free for 1 month to experience all the benefits that you get from being a full member. You sign up for 1 month, you get access to the Gauge-O Guild website, you can explore the latest Gazette and Guild news, look through all the archives. The knowledge base, which was formerly called the Wiki, is almost like an O-gauge modelling encyclopedia. If you want to know anything, it's probably in there somewhere, and lots of ways to search that. And there's a huge list of all the traders and what products they actually produce, as well as links to our Guild YouTube channel and gallery. You can find out about forthcoming events, not just the face-to-face ones, but all of the virtual events. We've got a virtual show planned again for the 5th of November, and you can look at the forum where people go on and ask advice from each other, post pictures of their latest projects, and that network is extremely valuable. And at the end of the 1 month free trial, we'll actually send you a message and say, would you like to convert to full membership? You don't have to, but obviously it's quite nice to have the ability to try before you buy, as the poster says, and see what the Gauge O Guild can offer you. Joining is on an annual basis. So if you join in September, you renew the following September, so you get a full 12 months. And as we said, if you want to join, it's just join online, which comes down from the About Us arrow on the top here. And you literally go on, fill in your details, and then click free month membership. So very easy to get started. Thank you to everybody. We're going to see you again on Sunday, the 26th of June. Hopefully I will see some of you face to face in Doncaster. We're looking forward to the show at the Dome a week later, this year only, because obviously to clash with the Queen's Jubilee would have been difficult for many people who've got other things going on that they'll be involved in. Thank you again to Steve. Thank you again to everybody for joining. There's no point having these evenings if nobody comes. So we really appreciate all of the contributions. And as I say, if you know anybody who might be able to do an evening with, or if you'd like to volunteer yourself, please get in touch and please give me any feedback after the events as well.
Jackie, just before we go, Steve has messaged that he will be on the GOG Technical Committee stand at Doncaster for anybody that's going to the show. So that'll be where to find him. It's
stand 2, which is Guild Services. So you'll see Steve, people from publications and people from membership all there telling you everything about what we can offer and the support they can give from the Guild. I'm getting a message on my screens, Ian, saying that there's another new one coming. I can't see. Oh, here we are. We've got a thank you for a very interesting session along with the video. It's been most entertaining event. Steve saying where he's going to be, and another message from Dave Robinson saying thanks, very interesting.
Yeah.
So lots of really positive feedback. Excellent. Thank you to all. And I hope to see you in Doncaster. And if not, I'm sure you'll enjoy the next session on the 26th of June. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Ian, for your support, and Richard.
Pleasure.
And a final thank you again to Steve. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good night, Jackie.
Good night.